Hi, I'm Mark Wigley.
And I am Beatriz Colomina, and we are very happy to participate in this event of Muntadas, the Empty City.
The City of Trauma is the theme that we're going to talk about, and our idea was that we'll both of us address the same question from different points of view, and then we'll have a conversation and see which way this links. But as Beatriz said, this is a kind of homage to Muntadas and this fascinating project. And we start with Beatriz.
Okay, so I will share my screen now and start my bit. Let's see. Share the screen. Slideshow. Start from the beginning. Fantastic. Okay, the architecture of trauma. What you see now in the screen is, let me see, is kind of a grid of empty beds, which you may have seen in the press. These white beds in a dark cavernous space, which is actually waiting for bodies. One architecture, you could say, has been made inside another. This is a field hospital that, as you know, was set up in a few days to accommodate 5,500 patients in Madrid in a convention center. So a building that was designed for temporal events is now hosting an emergency medical architecture. You can say a space for disease. But it's not just Madrid, of course. It was also in Belgrade, in Serbia, this sports hall full of beds, or the Javis Center in New York, and so many other situations. But you can also see that this is not a new story. In fact, we tend to forget very quickly the emergencies of other times. Think, for example, about the 1918 flu, sometimes not known as the Spanish flu. We know very well that didn't originate in Spain, but in the United States. Now they complain a lot that they call COVID Chinese virus, but they keep talking about the Spanish flu as if we were responsible for the Spanish flu, which actually originated in Kansas. So this is another story. But anyway, here you have patients in field hospital during the 1918 flu in the United States. So here again, so all these cavernous spaces occupied by beds that until recently we had forgotten. But in fact, we could argue more, or take a wider view and say that it's not just the pandemics of the 20th century, but in fact that all architecture in fact is sick, that illness and architecture are in fact inseparable. It could be even argued that the beginning of architecture is the beginning of disease, as this fellow Dr. Ward Richardson put it in his introduction to this book, Our Homes and How to Make Them Healthy, which is a kind of compendium of tests written by architects and doctors for the 1884 International Health Exhibition in London. And here you have some of the illustrations of this book and the plan of the exhibition. It was a major exhibition on health. And the cover of the catalog and some of the illustrations. This doctor wrote that man, and I'm only going to write the last part of this quote, that man in constructing protection from exposure has constructed the conditions of disease. So in other words, you can argue that there is no disease without architecture, and in fact doctors and architects have always been in a kind of dance, often exchanging roles, collaborating, influencing each other, even if not always totally synchronized. Furniture, as you can see, for example, in this illustration from the exhibition in London, but rooms, also buildings and cities are actually produced by medical emergencies that live layer upon layer in the cities over the centuries. And this is the amazing thing. We tend to forget very quickly what produced these layers. We act as if every pandemic was the first, as if trying to bury the pain and the uncertainty of the past. Modern architecture, and here again you have another kind of forgetting, right? So you have here volunteers of the Red Cross in Boston, again during the pandemic. And I think the whole thing about the mask that has been so important for us, and also it seemed like this foreign thing, but we forget that we were wearing very similar masks actually for centuries. This is the 1918, but think about this doctor, this plague doctor in the 17th century that went around dressed like this and with this mask with this very long beak to keep people at bay. And also it held, this mask held scented herbs that were to protect against miasma. Miasma was the theory that thought that that it was a smell that transmitted disease, and therefore countering the smell was a way of preventing disease. But of course, we may also remember the mask of Ebola, and how far away seems Ebola now, and how similar those situations are to what is happening right now with this hospital in Wuhan at the beginning of the pandemic, and how masks have become part of everyday life. In fact, sometimes even you see images that are so parallel, like this one, for example, where you can see cholera in Palermo in 1835, and this kind of waiting vehicle for the dead body picked up by these two characters. And here is something that those of us living in New York during the first months of the pandemic got to see quite frequently, which is two characters, also an ambulance, the waiting vehicle, the nurses, the medical doctors, totally dressed up in like astronauts, and even the patient encased in this bubble, like very much reminiscent of the 1960s, about to be placed in this ambulance. But in fact, as I say, cities are always has always been produced by medical emergency, but this is the interesting thing. As soon as the pandemic, as soon as the emergency passes, we tend to develop amnesia. We act as if pandemic is the first. And yet we could argue, as I said, that the history of the city is the history of the disease. You could write a very interesting story that will only look at the city from the history of the city from the point of view of the disease, and a kind of different story will emerge. This is, for example, the construction on the right of the embankment of London that was produced after the great stink. Within the Thames, with all these bodies. So the pandemics of the 19th century brought us the infrastructure that we take for granted today, like clean water and sewage system, the parks, etc. But they also, as we saw before, revolutionized the design of the interior of furniture and of buildings. In fact, this, if you go back historically, you realize that the relationship between architecture and illness goes back to the very beginning of architectural theory. So here is Vitruvius, who in the 1st century BC, he's already, he of course launched architecture theory precisely by insisting that all architects need to study medicine. Why? Because the most important goal, the chief object of the architect is healthfulness. And now he devotes a large part of these 10 books on architecture to the question of health, giving very precise instructions on how to decide whether there is a healthy site for a proposed city by sacrificing an animal that lives there and inspecting the liver and making sure that it's sound and firm. And in reverse, he also thought that all those who are unwell will be cured by architecture. So architecture is a form of cure. And jumping very, this is very interesting because in the Renaissance, the schools of architecture, the first school of architecture was the School of Disegno in Florence, and in the 1500s, and by Vasari. And it's very interesting that they could have placed themselves everywhere in the city, but they placed themselves next to the medicine schools, And actually the students of architecture, the students of design were asked and required to attend dissection, the same way that the students of medicine were required to attend dissection, except that the students of architecture were supposed to be there drawing this decomposing body for days on end, for weeks on end, even as they were getting sick, and there were reports that they were vomiting and getting sick, and nevertheless they have to be there. So this goes on throughout the century, but since we don't have time, I will jump quickly to the 20th century just to insist that modern architecture itself defines itself against bacteria. That modern architecture, you can argue, that was produced in emergency conditions. Millions were dying throughout the world from tuberculosis. I mean, it's very easy to forget how dramatic it was, but globally, 1 in 7 people were dying of tuberculosis globally. In places like the United States, and there's a lot of empty space in the United States, it was 1 in 5. And if you went to cities like Paris, dense cities, it was 1 in 3. So we now are very traumatized, of course, by COVID, but it's no comparison with the millions of people that were dying. And modern architecture took upon themselves to treat this issue. In fact, it's amazing to me how historians of modern architecture have tried to avoid reflecting on this reality. But look at this cover of the magazine Revista Nacional de Arquitectura of Madrid, the most important architectural journal around that time, that still in 1952 is juxtaposing this image of a modern building with the sun and with an X-ray of the chest, in case you needed any convincing that in fact modern architecture was produced in defense against tuberculosis. So everything we understand as modern architecture, whether it's white buildings or smooth surfaces or big expanses of glass or solar terraces for the even exercise, because of course the healthy body is the exercise body, etc., were actually prescribed as a way to prevent, if not to cure, tuberculosis. But this is also very interesting, because even if this has been not acknowledged in histories of architecture that talk about these white buildings in terms of style, for example, or form, in fact, it's even more amazing that modern architects didn't invent anything new in a way, because all this all they did was to absorb the design principles that were already inherited by the sanitary reform movement for people like Florence Nightingale, for example, where she, in her Notes on Hospitals of 1859, talk about the requirements of the healthy homes very much in the same way that she have talked before in a text called Notes on Hospital about the requirements of a healthy hospital. So what is it that you need to have a healthy hospital? And this is the illustration of Florence Nightingale: ventilation, large windows, clean lines, smooth surfaces, white walls, minimal utilitarian furniture, no fabrics, no carpets, no decoration. So exactly the same things that modern architecture will prescribe. So in many ways, actually visiting nurses will accompany patients that have been discharged from hospital to their home and advise them on how to make their home healthy by asking them to paint their walls white, to open the windows, to eliminate the carpets and the curtains. Why? Because it was believed, and it's true, that the bacillus of tuberculosis was hiding in the dust. In fact, I will tell you that that's correct, that if you have tuberculosis and you spit, and this spot now is dry, 15 days later it's still contagious. But if you expose it to the sun for even a few minutes, it becomes neutralized. So they were onto something. So modern architects, they actually took this and somehow gave it form. So all 19th century architecture full of carpets and knickknacks and all this stuff that accumulates dust was demonized, like this in this poster for the Siedlung of Stuttgart. right? With this red cross, no more of this. And what do we have instead? We have the modern building of Le Corbusier and the modern woman dressed in white, the modern car, which doesn't look that modern anymore, and all the principles of modern architecture, of detaching the house from the ground, because in the ground is where, as Le Corbusier said, the seas breathe, and opening the windows, and all these things that will revolutionize a modern architecture. So at the center of architecture, there is always this body, and I've always talked about the body in architecture, and it's always somehow this heroic body of Leonardo, or the heroic body of Le Corbusier, of the modular. It's always an exercise body, a kind of macho body. But in fact, my point will be that at the center of modern architecture, there's actually a weak body. It's a nil body, a sick body that we have somehow neglected. And I'm going to talk about that very quickly by giving you an example, which is Paimio. Paimio is very well known in the history of modern architecture. It's a sanatorium in Finland with these very dramatic terraces up in the roof, where you can see all these, I don't know what my notes are, but here, where the patients were wheeled out to take the cure, and you see these very clean bedrooms full of decoration with these very clean beds, all designed not to accumulate the dust. Even the intersection of the wall and the ceiling is curved to not accumulate dust here. And all the sanitary fittings were designed by the architects as well, including the door handles that were designed to not catch the doctors' sleeves of the white coats. But in fact, the main technology was this, if you want, is this terrace on the top floor where patients were wheeled out to take the cure. Here you have all these patients lying down in this fabulous chaise longue designed by Aino Alto, and you see that it's also designed so that there is no way it can accumulate any dust. And it's also very interesting that Aino Alto, one of the architects of this project, who is by Aino and Alvar Aalto, always saying, of course, in architectural history, Alvar Aalto, but it's a lie, as he was fully involved. And you have that Aino Aalto has decided to present herself not like the usual heroic architect standing in front of the building, but precisely like the weak patient lying down on this chaise longue in the terrace of Paimio. Tuberculosis in many ways, here you have the patients in the terrace, made modern architecture modern. And it's not that, as many people think, that modern architects design modern sanatoriums. That would be too easy. Aalto was actually a quite good neoclassic architect before what he calls his conversion, as if it was some sort of religious awakening, to functionalism. When he entered the competition for this sanatorium in King Koma, which he didn't win, but the project in many ways anticipates by him. He writes about the main purpose of the building being a tuberculosis sanatorium, is to function as a medical instrument, he says. The room design is determined by the depleted strength of the patient reclining in his chair, in his bed, in his long chair, right? So it's very interesting too that to know that Aalto himself had been sick at the time of the competition for the building, and claimed that having to lie in bed for such an extended period of time had been crucial to his understanding of the problem. He says architecture is always conceived for the person in the vertical position, but here you have a patient, a client that is permanently on the horizontal, and he makes these very beautiful drawings of the situation. I think this is a completely revealing observation, because of course if the patient is constantly on the horizontal, the whole design of the room and of the building has to change, right? And I think this is very significant. So lights cannot remain in the ceiling, kind of irritating the eyes of the patient lying on the floor. And the view to the outside also has to be calculated from the point of view of this patient that is lying on the chair. So these very, very thin rails and low parapets allow the eye of this patient lying on the terrace, but also on the room to kind of travel far away into the landscape. He also speaks about colors, quite dark hues of blue for the ceiling and the walls in lighter shades, and bright canary yellow in the reception by the entrance and in the linoleum of the lobby, the staircases and the corridors, he says, to evoke sunny optimism, even in cold and cloudy days. Psychological factors were also very important to him. He says, and I bet you he's right, an extended period of confinement can be extremely depressing for a bedridden patient. A hospital, he says, has to be thought as a new kind of house. Well, that's normal, no? You want to make the hospital more comfortable, it has to be like a house. But then he reverses it, and I think that's the most interesting moment when he says a house should be like a sanatorium. And he talks about how he was able to discover that the spatial and psychological reactions by patients provide good pointers for housing. So this is the thing, that the bodily and psychological sensitivity of the sick person becomes now a way to recalibrate architecture. And even the specialized furniture that was designed for Paimio, like this Paimio chair, which was designed to open the chest of the patient and allow it to breathe easier, became everybody's chair. So for the sanatorium, the Aaltos say the sanatorium needed furniture which should be light, flexible, easy to clean, and so on. And after extensive experimentation in good, the flexible system was discovered to produce furniture which was suitable for the long and painful life in a sanatorium. Okay, so they established a workshop where they produce all these chairs, but this is the amazing thing. 2 years after, this workshop turned into Artec, and Artec is producing precisely the same kind of furniture for everybody. So turns out that the long and painful life in a sanatorium becomes the model for everybody's furniture. When they say, for example, in the propaganda, in the publicity for Artec, that the ambition was to support and nourish humans' being, physical and psychological well-being. So the reference point for the Aaltos was the seriously ill. Aalto even claimed that the architects have always to design for the person in the weakest position. So the tuberculosis patient in that sense becomes the model for modern architecture. In other words, sickness is no longer seen as the exception, but as the norm, and varying degrees of sickness define, of course, the human condition. The modern subject has multiple ailments, physical and psychological, and architecture is a protective cocoon, not just against the weather and other outside threats, but in modernity, more notably against internal threats, physical, physiological, and bodily ailment. It's also symptomatic that Aalto compares his experiments in Paimio and their application to everyday use to the exaggerated forms of analysis that scientists use in order to obtain more clear, visible results, such as stained bacteria for microscope examination. So in a way, he saw design as a form of medical research, with the sanatorium acting as a kind of research lab for modern architecture, a way of testing architecture, looking at what has been hidden, exposing the invisible forces. And with this, I will end by saying that the actual clients of modern architecture are actually invisible. So if you think about it, Sigmund Freud, the X-ray, bacteriology, and even the germ theory of the design all emerged in the very short, same short period of time, and are all about looking inside. That is acknowledging the invisible, the unconscious, the skeleton, the micro element of the bacteria, the bacillus of tuberculosis. And architecture, likewise, in this moment turns itself inside out. The threat is no longer outside, let's say in the elements, in the weather, but inside, in the invisible. The micro scale of the bacteria became the base for furniture, rooms, spaces, and cities. The micro, if you want, and the macro, the bacterium and the cities. Cities were suddenly seen to be teeming with these unseen occupants that, in a sense, became the new clients of modern architecture. And I think this is very relevant to today, because also we have seen with COVID how these invisible microorganisms are so relevant. And in fact, they are already redesigning our cities and our architecture. So with this, I pass on to Mark. I stop share, and then maybe we can discuss later. Thank you very much.
Well, I try to offer some reflections that pick up on this amazing exploration of Beatrice of the intimate relationship between sickness and furniture, rooms, buildings, and cities, and the fact that this goes back from Vitruvius or even earlier. So it's in a way the real story. As you said at the very end, sickness is not the kind of exception for architecture, but it's the beginning. It's the norm in a way.
Yeah, and it's just not just by architecture, for everything else. I mean,
Yeah.
we act like this is an obsession, but most of our time, of our life, whether we are small and babies, or we are old people, or we fell in the street, or we are sick, we are vulnerable.
Exactly.
And
exactly.
we tend to think that architects tend to think that designing for this strong man, who is this, and how long does it last?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And strong men we don't really need, actually. So in that spirit, I offer you some not very strong words on a kind of slightly different angle, but I think will connect, I hope, to what Beatrice was saying, and also to the project of Montadas. And we thought we can make this bridge through this question of trauma, because this and this I think is the most obvious connection. The most obvious architectural symptom of the pandemic was empty cities. So almost you could say one of the symptoms of the disease. You could say the pandemic produces certain adjustments of the breathing, actually makes it very difficult to breathe, but also made some kind of adjustment of the city itself. And the city itself appears different. And this city, city of disease, is a city without life. So it is already, let's say, a kind of image of death, let's say. I mean, somehow the strange feeling that we all had that inside hospitals, but also inside houses, there is a suffering and a difficulty to survive, and a fear of the outside. And the outside, precisely because there are no people, looks like actually humanity has gone. So in a way, the trauma is immediately there. Even at the beginning, even with the first news of the pandemic, is the possibility of the death of the human species. And this death, this absence of the human, is somehow made visible in this empty city. And an empty city is, let's say, not just any old empty thing. An empty city is not like an empty glass or an empty calendar, right? Or an empty field. Emptiness in a city is something like super emptiness, because cities are thought of to be full. Cities are not just full, but they are like our image of fullness. Cities are seen to be incredibly dense spaces of interaction, of transaction, of vitality. In fact, a city, to be a city, is not only full, but kind of overflowing. It has a kind of surplus, a kind of extra. There's a kind of a density that forces new kinds of connection, new kinds of invention. So when we think city, we think fullness. So an empty city is a dead city, and a dead city is a dead human species, right? This is the fear. So in a certain way, the city itself was traumatized by the disease, and this trauma to the architecture also produces an even greater trauma in the human kind of self-image, let's say. So I want to look again at this emptiness which is photographed precisely by Montadas in his reflection on the meaning of the empty city. And as with Beatrice, I want to consider the possibility that this emptiness, this wound, this trauma, is not something that simply happens to cities. It's not simply a disaster, but is actually part of the kind of way that cities organize themselves and produce themselves. Or to say it maybe another way, there's emptiness at the very heart of every city. That is to say, at the heart of what makes a city a city. And in fact, we maybe should think, or maybe we always have to think about, does the city come after emptiness? Like, does the city arise in a kind of an empty space? Or is it a little bit the other way around, that cities actually produce the possibility of this kind of concept of the empty? Like before cities, would you think empty? I'm not so sure, right? What if war and disease, right? War and disease being the two most obvious ways of making a city empty. What if these are not like disasters to cities, but the nutrients, the very nutrients that produce the urban life? Or to say it another way around, what is it that emptiness, as it were, forces on us, or even, let's say, the trauma of perceived emptiness? What is a city without visible humanity? So it's not the humans have gone. It's not necessarily that anybody has died. It is that the image has gone, the self-image, the kind of reflection of ourselves as a kind of a species. This has not been by accident been a very big focus for artists, right? So Montadas in a way joins a tradition. Think of New York, for example, in the economic distress of the 1970s, where huge parts of the cities are becoming empty, kind of a wasteland. And immediately, not only are there artists there, Gordon Matta Clark and other members of the sort of a downtown group, but actually they're not just there photographing this emptiness. They themselves, as a group of artists, you could say, were produced by this emptiness. The emptiness, in a way, provoked their form of art, their form of reflection. It is not by accident, for example, that Thomas Struth is making this extended series of photographs of the empty New York in the 1970s. These are images of a city without people. The buildings are there. There is maybe a car sometimes, or a bicycle, or some garbage. But there is, let's say, the trace of the human who has gone. And of course, this was experienced as a huge trauma to the working class of New York. This moment of a kind of post-industrialization was a devastating and was the beginning of the massive inequities in our cities. And somehow this is already visualized, that in a certain way, the lack of the human is rendered in kind of architectural form in the emptiness. Emptiness doesn't mean decay or destruction. It means precisely that the buildings are still there, but they are somehow vacant. But even this tradition of thinking of the empty city, of the post-industrial city, let's say, the non-city, the kind of, or the city in transformation, the city of wounds and scars and gaps and vacancies, the vacant building, right? The vacant lot. Even the expression, the vacant lot. Again, when one can think of another moment in time, one can think of Atget's photographs of Paris in the late 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. His absolutely famous photographs of empty Paris. The photographs that are interpreted by Walter Benjamin as strangely giving birth to surrealism as an art form, and that are seen to document a so-called old Paris, a Paris that is going away. And these are haunted images. Haunted for Walter Benjamin, they are like crime scenes. They look like crime scenes. Something just happened. Somebody just left. A murder has taken place. The murder here, the crime here, maybe is at the human scale, at the species scale. Maybe there are some insects. Maybe there are some birds. In one photograph of Jay, there's a lonely horse wondering what happened to the people. Just a white horse just standing there in the middle of the emptiness. And it's, by the way, never just one photograph. It's 100 photographs, 1,000 photographs. Same with Matta Clark, many photographs. Same with Struth. Maybe it's in the nature of photographing an empty city that it requires all the film that you have, all the photography that you have. And remember, Benjamin is arguing that actually it's photography itself that makes possible. It's precisely in his short history of photography that he obsesses about these photographs of Atget. So there's something about the ability of the film to capture something that seems to have gone, that becomes for Benjamin the image of the possibility of not just losing the past, but generating some kind of future, some kind of new reality. So let's start again with these images, this way in which, and think of the millions of photographs of the emptiness by artists, by documentary photographers, by military, by business, by cities, by Instagram, by social media. The attempt to, as it were, fill this emptiness of the pandemic city with images, as if the more we would photograph it, the more we would have signs of our own being, in a kind of rabbit's hole of the human species chasing itself endlessly, looking for a kind of image, an image that is not there. Perhaps a selfie taken in an empty street is the perfect kind of example of the desperate attempt to reestablish one's humanity when actually humans have gone. But this fear we have, this fear of the empty street, this strangeness of the street, this threat to the human, this therefore all too human threat, this fear of the vacancy, this fear of stillness, this fear of the vacuum, this fear that the city was, after all, a kind of myth, a kind of a dream, or a kind of collective madness, a kind of Ponzi scheme that we'd all gather together in certain places on the planet and interact and generate amazing ideas. The idea that it could all sort of, as it were, disappear. This fear, of course, is related to the specific economy of cities, the extractive economy that forms cities. Cities don't simply appear in the middle of nowhere. They appear as kind of machines of extraction. Cities are produced by the exterior, by the landscape, by the agriculture, by the mines, by the fields, and by the workers. The center of the city, where we are so afraid of emptiness and so afraid of holes, these cities are produced by vast holes produced in the landscape all over the world, not just the enormous mines, but you could say even holes in our society, holes in people's brains, are massive holes, like the enormous holes used to extract resources from around the planet, but also the little holes in the unconscious and in the kind of micro extractive politics. All these holes that are produced by cities, not just as a kind of byproduct of the city, but a kind of mission of the city to perforate the world, to fill the world with holes. These holes, as I say, which are in the material world, in the mineral world, in the organic world, but also in the psychological world, in the kind of mental world. Whole regions are devastated by these economies, as we know. There is not just the empty city then, but there's also the empty region, the wasteland, the whole phenomenon of the shrinking city, all of Detroit, not just Detroit, but everything around it, all the industry around it. Think of the holes in the ozone layer that we have collectively produced, holes that are bigger than the size of continents, and that are in some incredibly intimate relationship with all the little holes in our brain, all the kind of micro perforations in everyday transactions. So cities are, if you like kind of huge mining machines. They're like machines of extraction that are processing, and always making holes. The city is kind of a hole-making machine. So when we get afraid of holes in the middle of the city, when we think this is the end of the species, perhaps we mean maybe this is the end of this system of extractive occupation of the planet and relationship to animals and bacteria and insects and birds and so on. So just to summarize, this discourse of the city, this classical image of the city as a city of fullness, that the image of a city alive is the image of millions of people doing millions of things with millions of colors moving in millions of different directions, which is an image of surplus, which is therefore an image of the economy. This image of fullness is actually made possible by holes, by many holes. Cities eat their outside, but also eat our insides. Right? So somehow, and I think this relates again to Beatrice's project, which so beautifully links the outside to the inside. They become so close. And by the way, if you think about cities, it is precisely in the inside of the inside, like in domestic life, where there is the most contact, right? Most exchange, most transaction, and most production, most reproduction, right? Also in the biggest, widest open spaces is the most contact. You are more likely to touch somebody inside your house and in a public park than in the streets. So if you look at the organization of a city, it's a very, very interesting system where contact, this thing that we think cities are all about, actually happens secretly inside the house and super secretly, paradoxically, in public. The most private act you can do, the most secret act you can do is touch somebody in the middle of a crowd. Right? And again, Walter Benjamin, the thinker of this kind of complexity. So if we are thinking holes, we're thinking holes in this astonishing system that links personal contact and transaction and inventiveness and so on in the super public and the super private spaces. Remember, of course, that the public spaces, the big empty spaces in cities, the squares, the parks, the plazas, are not only the sites of authoritarian control, they're also the sites of revolution and dissent. Like, these are the kind of political spaces. So again, let's think again about these images, right? The empty city can be produced by disease, can be produced by war, can be produced by terrorism. A terrorist threat precisely has the effect of emptying a city. Nobody wants to go near it. Can be produced by a nuclear disaster. Chernobyl can produce this sense of a ruined city. It could be a natural disaster. It could be a shifting of infrastructural lines, like a railway line that used to connect one city now changes path and the earlier city becomes a ghost town. In fact, it could be produced by a dam that floods a city. In fact, the world is absolutely filled with ghost towns. So again, ghost towns are not like an accident, are not like a strange thing. They are everywhere all the time. The landscape is filled with these kind of ghost towns. These ghost towns populate movies. Think of all those movies in which the future is portrayed, in which the present, the cities that we live in today, are empty, emptied out, turned into some sort of archaeological ruin. And these are not just, let's say, science fiction. Or is it what happened? And it was so amazing, the image you show where the patient in New York looks, as you said, like some kind of space person, these kind of strange rearrangements of the city produce a kind of science fiction in reverse. So just to finish this line of thought, what if the city is by definition wounded, by definition with holes, traumatic holes, holes which are also productive, are also responsible? Even the anxiety about those holes is responsible. You know, maybe cities are like epicenters of anxiety, like clusters and intensifications of anxiety, which produce kind of counter results. What if the city itself, physically, is a kind of monument to wounds? I give you an example, right? A tombstone, right? The thing we are most afraid of, the emptiness we are most uncertain about, the death of someone we love. There is no words, no process, nothing can account for the pain. Nothing can produce an image of this thing. So what do? What do a lot of cultures do? Put a stone in the ground that never moves, that never changes. We put an object there, a solid object, with the name of what it is that we have lost, as if that will somehow heal this wound, right? So what if cities are like graveyards? Just every building, the more confident it is, the more certain it is, the more stable it is, the more it is actually placed on one of these kind of acupunctures of trauma. So what if cities are kind of built out of trauma and are kind of denials of trauma? And what if everyday life is a kind of an attempt to forget all of this, and this everyday life of ours so efficiently assists mechanisms of producing more and more holes and more specific kind of traumas? So to finish then, the empty bed, the empty chair, the empty room, the empty street, the empty city, the empty region, right? All of these figures, these are figures of kind of a kind of trauma, a sort of system, a kind of architectural system that circles around trauma. And there wouldn't be this thought even. We wouldn't perhaps even be able to think the concept trauma without cities. So the question here is, I don't think either Beatrice and I speak like in the name of some new, more beautiful, more healthy, more equitable future so simply, because what we are both saying is it's not so simple, this question. It's not so clear what it means healthy, what it means equitable, and what is, let's say, the complicity of architecture. At the very least, it seems, architecture is much more on the side of the criminal than on the side of the decriminalization and so on. And I'm really kind of curious, Beatrice, your thoughts about how in the end, after thinking through how disease is, as it were, the architect of our physical life. What are we going to do with this knowledge, with this new understanding, this new kind of paradigm shift? Because in my view, you just see the world differently than it has been seen before.
Well, yeah, well, maybe not.
You know what I mean? Like usually architects are just so convinced that they're going to save the world.
It's so interesting, particularly in terms of health, that architects have always been insisting, precisely because it's such a traumatic realization that from the beginning, the moment there is architecture, there is disease, that a lot of diseases that didn't exist. I mean, actually tuberculosis goes back to the Neolithic. So the moment, as this fellow say in the 1800s, but they must have known it before, that the moment we went indoors, the moment we created architecture, right, the moment we created cities, we created the conditions for disease. They have been this insistence that they are producing health. The architects are countering this threat that is disease. So actually reversing the situation, which is kind of fantastic if you think about it. Now, in these times of COVID, actually, the question of the city and whether the city is also producing disease has very much come to the fore, right? I mean, 1 million people apparently, we notice it in the street. It's amazing. There's nobody. Talk about the empty city. I just walked down. I went to do an errand and came back, and I thought to myself, how is it possible? It's almost rush hour in New York. I passed through the whole of Soho. There's nobody in the sidewalk. You say that we don't rub against each other. A lot of people rub against each other in New York. Have you ever been in the subway? Come on. I mean, everybody's touching everybody, even if you don't want to. I mean, and, apart, there are all these people that they derive some pleasure from that, but they rub you in the sidewalk and they rub you in the subway.
Yeah, it's in public, right?
And they are constantly rubbing you. So touch is very much, and now it's empty, right? And 1 million people have left, as 1 million people left after 9/11. And of course, in Spain, it's also the same. I read when I was there a couple of months ago that all these people are moving to the countryside, and precisely ghost towns of Spain, ghost small towns and country that the school have closed, that they now have to reopen the school because these people from Madrid have decided to move to the countryside. So you think that's the future? Because I'm such an urbanite that I'm terrified by that future. But I don't think it's the future. But I was curious.
Well, I wonder because architects, yeah, it's amazing what you say, that right. So architects present themselves as doctors, healing a problem that it turns out that they cause.
They cause themselves.
So of course it's good business that you are both causing the problem and solving the problem.
Yeah.
And in this sense, I would see the emptiness in this light, right? That perhaps we haven't thought through what kind of emptiness architects produce. So in other words, if emptiness is treated as a symptom, as a problem, as a pathology that needs to be addressed, and architects are always offering some new kind of fullness, more life, more energy, more equity, more. You know, even Mies, even the architect saying less is more. Well, he's saying it's more. So he's going to give you more by giving you less, right? So what we is always slightly out of our vision is what are the holes and the gaps that we produce. I think a lot of new research is, you know, the people that think about labor, like what is the hidden labor, they're looking at these holes, right? They're looking at what are this, off to one side of the object, what are the gaps that are produced by this fullness? So as architecture appears as an object in its fullness, and these beautiful images of everybody so happy or whatever, what one doesn't see are all the gaps that are produced. And if one could almost, as it were, draw these gaps and would see a kind of design that might be more complex and more interesting than what we see. And in that sense, your emphasis on the invisible becomes interesting, right? Like, so what is the invisible architecture that was always there as part of all those projects that we have looked at in visual terms, right, up until now? And I'm thinking, if one looks at these unseen gaps and so on, thinks about the extractive role of architecture and so on, thinks of its complicity with disease, etc., maybe other kinds of practice emerge.
Right,
you know?
right. But it made me think also what you were saying about what the pandemic has made visible, which is, of course, the invisible city
Yeah,
of all these halls, of all these things that are normally hidden.
right.
You know, the invisible city of all these workers that have to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and
Yeah.
take the subway in New York, which was the most terrifying thing during the first months of the pandemic, and it continues to be horrifying space. And they don't have a choice, right? So here we are teaching on Zoom and giving lectures on Zoom, and there's a huge amount of the population that doesn't have that privilege. And I think in many ways, the pandemic has also made visible a lot of things that are normally hidden, like all these inaccessible or unequal access to healthcare, in brutal inequalities in a city like New York, the service population that makes possible all this energetic and fantastic city, and that we didn't see until this moment, and then it became visible. Became very, very visible, not just literally visible, but visible in the accounts, in the reflections, in our understanding all of a sudden that of what was actually happening.
Yeah, and it's, when you
that's
say
another thing that is not empty. The subway is not empty. Why is it not empty? Because there's a lot of people that still there that has to maintain this emptiness.
Yeah, so this is there were two thoughts that go through my mind when you're saying this. For the first time, I think, firstly, exactly what you just said, right? That actually the space of the invisible space is crowded, right? So the disadvantaged, one of the symptoms of being disadvantaged is overcrowding. Right. Classically, in the history of our species.
Yeah.
So in a way, again, these objects the architect makes that are supposed to give us so much fullness to everyone are kind of built not only on kind of holes and extraction and so on, but also a kind of overcrowding, right? But the other thought I was thinking is, when Aalto says, what about designing, and shouldn't we design for the person in the weakest position? When I'm hearing you now, I think, well, what if one replaced the word person with, for example, group or a species? Or, like, in other words, what if the issue is not simply to think of the person in the weakest position, but also could be the group, the community, the neighborhood, but also, is the human the species in the weakest position, right? Like
yeah, that's another one. We are always thinking about ourselves, right? But yeah, and I think I was talking in terms of Aalto, in terms of the person in the weakest position, referring to the sick person. But we can also talk about all the people that are in a vulnerable position, and in that sense, and maybe we could finish with this. The city of the future will be, or the one that we wish for, will be one that will take care of all the most vulnerable people in it, right?
Yeah, and this word care you use, of course, is a word about disease and health and care and so on. But care might be, it would be wouldn't be a kind of patronizing. I have the cure for you, whether it be for the disenfranchised or for other species or for the planet or whatever, right? It would require some kind of respect for the disease, right? And I think this is, again, it's so interesting that you show how architects modeled themselves on the people studying bacteria and, as it were, learning from the disease, right? Learning from, so not only perhaps learning from the weakest person, but learning from what it is that has weakened them, right? And I think that in this sense, again, returning to Montadas, I suppose we're trying to say something like why we think that work's amazing, like why photographs of these empty streets and reflections on
Mm.
economic life,
Mm.
for example, in a city in Spain, why that triggers all these bigger questions about the history of our field, right? And repositioning.
Mhm.
Because I'm sure your work does not leave the architect. I mean, maybe it's the last question for you. Does the figure of the architect survive your reading? Like, is something else, you know what I mean? The kind of getting back to where we started, who needs another?
You don't need another hero with Barbara Kruger, no? That beautiful poster that she has with this boy, and we don't need another hero. Thank you very much.
Yeah, it was a pleasure to be with you, and congrats to Tanya.
Montadas and
Bye to all of you.
Bye.